I will be talking to you about spiritual development. Life is wonderful, and human life is especially marvelous. Like all other living beings, humans are born, grow, multiply, and die. But our integrated and healthy growth includes much more than physical or psychomotor development. A healthy human development includes intellectual, social, emotional, and spiritual rich elements. Often, however, we neglect our spiritual formation most of all, and that has dreadful long-term consequences. In this video, I will discuss the kind of training necessary to promote proper spiritual growth. Let's begin by reading Paul's first letter to Timothy in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 in the Living Bible. Don't waste time arguing over foolish ideas and silly myths and legends. Spend your time and energy in the exercise of keeping spiritually fit. Bodily exercise is all right, but spiritual exercise is much more important and is a tonic for all you do. So exercise yourself spiritually and practice being a better Christian, because that will help you not only now in this life, but in the next life too. The text is clear. Spiritual fitness requires exercise and energy. This is true about the other elements too. Whether it would be the physical, the social, the intellectual, or the emotional, one can be developed without the appropriate action and the necessary effort. The physical development depends on our connection with our body and what we practice with it. The social development depends on our relationships with other people, which happens through our bodies. We have to learn how to cultivate good relationships. The intellectual development depends on our connection with various skills and knowledge that we achieve through our body, specifically through our brains. Emotional development depends on our connection to our emotions we experience by means of our bodies. We have to learn to use and control our emotions. In the same way, our spiritual development depends on our relationship with God, which we seek and maintain through our bodies. If you want, you can pause this video for a little while and reflect and discuss these ideas. So now, what is spiritual training? Let's see it as a rhythmic process. Let's imagine it as a series of movements that spiral into growth. We have to practice these movements personally and in groups. We implement them personally in our daily meditations, prayers, and similar activities. However, it is essential that we also frequently practice them in a group or in community. We started these movements somewhere in the middle of our life experiences. And then we moved towards faith. And then we return to our regular life experiences, but this time enlightened, empowered, and challenged by our faith. There are 5 movements in this journey. It is important that you remember them. I hope you can learn them through this presentation, but feel free to watch the video as often as you need to make yourself comfortable with the process. The idea is that you can set these movements in motion anytime, anywhere, whether you are praying, reading, worshiping, or doing any other spiritual practice. The first movement is reading the Bible. We want to relate our life and our experience with some biblical text, whether we are reading it or reviewing it in our memory. Movement 2 is reflection. We reflect on our encounter with God through the Bible. Movement 3 is imagination. Here we imagine in order to act. The 4th movement is commitment. In this movement, we commit ourselves to God, to ourselves, and to our community. And then move 5 is action. Here is where we carry out our commitments. So here are the 5 movements. We must keep them in mind while we exercise spiritually. Movement 1, reading. 2, reflection. 3, imagination. 4, commitment. And 5, action. Let's start with movement 1, reading. This movement consists of 2 steps. The first is to have an initial encounter with the biblical text. We read or wonder how God is speaking to us through the text. The key concept to remember is initial encounter. The second step consists of studying that text in its context, clarifying doubts, and remembering key knowledge that we may have about the text. The key concept to remember here is study. Now let's look at movement 2. Do you remember what it is? Exactly. Movement 2 is reflection. First we read and then we reflect. Movement 2 also consists of 2 steps. First, we identify in our readings the personal, social, and ethical themes that concern us most. We look up relevant information and reflect on these things. The key concept here is relevant issues, or pertinent themes, like it says on the slide. The next step is to pray. We ask God for wisdom and learn to trust Him. In our prayers, we also identify our faults and sins and ask God for forgiveness. We also try to strip ourselves of prejudices, pride, interests, desires, or anything else that might prevent us from being transparent before God. Communally, we share with others our experience of forgiveness and transparency. The key concept to remember in this step is prayer. And now movement 3. Do you remember what it is? Correct. Movement 3 is the imagination. We imagine in order to act. And this movement also consists of 2 steps. In the first step, we visualize personally and as a group how we could participate in God's redemptive story. A key concept to remember is the story of redemption. The second step is to take note of the consolations and desolations related to our participation in the story of redemption. We express our desolations in prayers of lament and consolations in praise and thanksgiving. Let me explain this a little bit more. As we imagine our participation in the story of redemption, things will come up that make us sad, afraid, or discouraged. We express those in prayers of lament. But there will also be things that give us joy and optimism. We express them in praise and thanksgiving. The key concepts to remember are desolations and consolations. So now movement 4, do you remember what it is? Commitment. Perfect. Here we commit ourselves to participate with God in the unfolding of His glorious plan. We keep in mind that the mission belongs to Him and that we are participating because of His grace. This movement also takes 2 steps. First, we identify our commitments and the spiritual disciplines we need. We ask God for help, acknowledging that we can only fulfill our commitments through the power of the Holy Spirit. The key concepts to remember are commitments and disciplines. In the next step, we plan how we can participate in God's plan personally and corporately as a church, embodying the life of Jesus on earth. The key concept to remember here is planning. So now finally, do you remember what movement 5 is? Exactly, it is the action. Here we put our commitments into practice, paying special attention to the mysterious presence of God in our midst. The key concepts to remember are practice and the presence of God. Now, what comes next? What do you think? Celebration. We celebrate the grace and power of God in what we have experienced through our journey. Additionally, from this point, we start a new journey empowered, enlightened, and challenged by the faith God has given us. Now, let's see if we remember the movements in this training plan for spiritual development. What is movement 1? Yes, it's reading. And movement 2, right? Reflection. And then movement 3, you got it, imagination. Movement 4, commitment, perfect. And now last movement 5. Good, it's action. So now what comes after those 5? Perfect, celebration. Here we have the 5, or better said, the 6 movements: reading, reflection, imagination, commitment, action, and celebration. Do you remember the key concepts in the steps related to reading? What is the key concept in the first step? Right, it's initial encounter. And then the second step? Good, it's study. And the steps related to reflection, what is the first one of those? Right. The first step has to do with pertinent themes, and then the second, good, it's prayer. So then the steps related to imagination, what's the first one of those? Exactly, the story of redemption. And then the second, yes, consolations and desolations. And then what are the steps related to commitment? What's the first one of those? Right, commitments and disciplines. And then the second, right, it's planning. So what are the key concepts related to the action? You got it. Practice and presence of God. And what's after the action? Celebration. Perfect. Okay, now go ahead. Let us get engaged in training ourselves for a fitted spiritual life, a life that can maintain a renewing relationship with God. Blessings on your training for spiritual formation.